So today I want to start with an interesting history lesson for everyone. Did you know that the reason that video game arcades went down in popularity and had to adapt to different, bigger styles of video games is because of the rise of the home video game system? It's actually very, very fascinating. So what winds up happening is that in the arcades, you put your money in. Traditionally, it was always a quarter. You put the quarter in, and you have so many lives in order to keep playing the game. And once those are gone, you then have to add more money into the machine to continue playing. This was how arcades made so much money. If you're sitting in front of Pac-Man trying to get the highest score, you're going to keep pumping as many quarters as you can in order to keep playing, in order to get that highest score. However, all of that started to change. Once games that used to be played in arcades started being released so that you could play them in your home, the amount of money that arcades started to take in started to go down. You see, no longer did you have to sit in front of an arcade machine pumping in quarters, hoping that you could beat the game. No, you could play the game at your own pace in the comfort of your own home for as long as you possibly wanted. You could simply play at home and take all the time you needed to master the levels, how the ghosts move about, how the Goombas move, all of these things. In an arcade, death of a character had more stakes because it cost you more. You see, you either had to pay a lot more money to keep playing, or you had to be very, very good. Arcades made death in video games mean something important. Death in a game meant something because at some point, you're going to run out of quarters. Your mom or your dad or whoever would only give you enough quarters to get through a certain amount of time. And not to sound weirder than I am sure I just did, but death should mean something. Whether it's in video games or whether it's in real life. It should have some sort of impact or effect on us because of the magnitude of what it is. Because that is what death is always seen as. Death is always looked at as the end, period. And again, that's how arcade games made money. They literally found a way to profit off of death. I guess I have a hard time getting over that fact. That back in the day, the idea of dying in an arcade game seemed so final because you only had so many quarters. You only had so much money. And that it was such this horrible thing because I've played games at arcades and I've played those same games in the comfort of my own home as a kid. And the fact that I could just go home and play over and over and over again, it didn't mean that it was over. If I died, I could just restart freely. See, we don't talk about death, though. It's like this big, bad, scary taboo thing. So we find ways to talk about it via video games, via books, and via movies. We don't talk about it because it's the end, it's final. And the thought of the end, the thought of what awaits us on the other side of abject oblivion terrifies us. We live our lives as children in arcades, terrified of running out of quarters. And we do everything we possibly can to keep pumping quarters into the machine of this world to keep going. We take vitamins, we take necessary precautions, we do all of these things in order to keep buying time on the machine. And I think that's the heart of the Old Testament reading today. Mortal, can these bones live? I have to confess, I absolutely adore this passage. The book of Ezekiel is wonderful and full of such great poetry and things, and I adore this passage, and it boils down to the simplest question, mortal, can these bones live? Now, the bones very clearly in Ezekiel's context were the house of Israel, because again, we have to remember the context that Ezekiel is in isolation. Ezekiel is in Babylon, far away from Jerusalem. The bones were literally them stuck in the Babylonian exile. They were displaced, dead, defeated, and downtrodden, completely cut off from God. Now, I wonder why it is that this passage comes up to us today in the lectionary. Maybe it's because that is how we feel exactly. Mortal, can these bones live? When we look at the news, when we see everything that's going on, we ask ourselves, what is going on? Death is knocking at the door, and we ask, can these bones live? Can what we once had come back? Because what we have now is terrifying. Ezekiel's answer is our answer. Oh God, you know. God is the only one who knows the answer to that. So God tells Ezekiel to speak. Prophesy, he said. Tell these bones to live. And he does that. He says, bones, you're gonna be okay. He says, God is going to take care of you, bones. God is going to cause these sinews and these muscles and your intestines and all the things that make us who we are. God is going to cause all these things to come back on you, and you will live again. And then there's this rattling and this great, beautiful, creepy image of bones coming together and flesh and muscle snaking up the bones, and now there's a pile of bodies, which I think is abjectly more creepier than a pile of bones, because they're not alive, they're just bodies. And so God tells him again, because these are not alive, they only look like they are alive, prophesy, mortal. Prophesy to the breath, prophesy to the wind, the ruach, the Spirit, the breath of God. Prophesy to this power and tell it to come in and cause these bodies to come alive. And he does. And the bodies become alive. It should be impossible. The people of Israel should have been dead and cut off, because they weren't in Jerusalem. They weren't where they thought where God lived. And that was the point of the exile. It was meant to weaken them and hurt them to a state where they could no longer function. To break their spirits, which is exactly what we have to combat against in the midst of this pandemic. But it didn't break them. God said, with God's own power, these bones can live again. New life comes from God. Death is not the end of the story when it comes to God. But we ignore all that, don't we? We believe that death is the end, period, end of sentence. We get so focused on the end result of going to heaven and partying with God that we don't even think about death, because it's just going to happen. You can't do it. Death and taxes. But we still fear death, don't we? We believe that death is the end. That unless we have some sort of tangible proof of resurrection, we're going to ignore the specter of death. And we do this because we're hard-hearted. Why do you think there's so many books about life and after death, and there's these movies and all of these things? The reason is because we don't actually believe in the resurrection. No, we say we do, but we don't live our lives as if we actually do. No, we are still terrified of what happens next. and this isn't even just about physical life after death, do we really believe that we can just bounce back from something traumatic? We can't get over the loss of a loved one or a job or all of this going on, that the world is literally coming to the end. I have seen so many people misuse the phrase apocalypse during this time. My head is spinning. We're terrified. And we desperately want to know if the power of the resurrection is real, not just on the physical level, but on the spiritual level. Can these bones live again? Or is this it? Is this the way the world is always going to be? Cut off and isolated from everyone. It's about hope, though. It's all about hope. See, we lose hope. The greatest source of power in the universe is hope. We ask daily, can these bones live again? And we should know already. We should know the answer. Yes, these bones can live again. But we don't. And the reason we don't is because we allow fear to overtake us every single day. We allow loss to overtake us every single day. We assume wrongly that loss and death are a game over. You're out of quarters and you're done. But God doesn't work like that. God is able to stare death in the face and say no. And this is what the story of Lazarus is all about today. You see, Lazarus and Jesus, they were buddies. Jesus is said to have loved Lazarus, just like he loved Mary, just like he loved Martha. He was very, very close to this family. And when he hears that Lazarus is sick, what does he do? He waits. He waits. He takes his good old sweet time getting back to him. 4 days. He waits 4 days to go and see Lazarus, when we all know, when everybody knows, that if Jesus was just there, none of this would have happened. Where were you, Lord? My brother was sick, and if you were here, you could have stopped this. You could have handled this before it got way out of control, but you didn't. And he tells Mary, because I am the life. I am the resurrection. All of this happened so that you may see and truly believe. Eventually he gets to the tomb, and Mary's there, and these people wailing and weeping, as was the custom. Mary and Martha are both there, and he has to go through the whole spiel again. Lord, if you were here, my brother wouldn't have died. Why did you allow this to happen? And he goes through the same spiel again. Do you believe? Do you really, truly believe that I am greater than death? And they say yes. So he goes to the body, and his reaction is so powerful, it is so poetic. He sees the tomb of his beloved friend Lazarus, and he weeps. He cries. He cries because his friend has died. And even though Jesus could have stopped it, and even though Jesus knows the end of this story, he still cries. He still weeps. It's because Jesus knows what it's like to lose someone you care about. Jesus knows what it's like to go through that pain, that trauma. And that is what makes Jesus so special to us. That Jesus gets it. Jesus relates to us on a very real, on a very physical, emotional, and visceral level. You see, when we experience a loss, Jesus is able to understand that. And Jesus is able to help us through that, through the situation. Jesus helps us to continue. You see, through Jesus, there's not the end. There's just more to the story. An ellipsis, if you will. Instead of a period, it is an ellipsis. And we know how this story ends up. It ends up with a very happy ending, especially if you're Lazarus, that even though it's going to smell real bad, he commands the stone to be rolled away. And he says in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And you see this bound figure that was dead for at least 4 days come stumbling out, bound together. The power of death is no more. The power of fear is no more because of Jesus Christ. Because there is more to this story. And that's what we have to do today. The only thing left for us to do now is to live as if this is actually true. Yeah, we can live absolutely terrified right now. And it's easy to do that. It's so easy to do that. But my question to you is this: is that living? Are we living our lives like we believe in God? Here's the thing. God gives everyone talents and blesses people, right? Like, we know that. And we know that there are precautions we can take in this time to help protect us and help protect our families. And we know scientists are also people divinely created by God who is giving people instructions. Practice social distancing, keep your hands clean, all this good stuff. We know all this stuff that we're supposed to do. And yet still, in the face of all of this, we allow ourselves to be so overtaken with fear. And the reason that we do that is because we are grieving this loss of what once was. You see, right now, we are the dry bones. We're Lazarus. Each and every one of us right now, in some way, has experienced the power of death and loss because the world as we knew it has drastically shifted. That's just how it is right now. I wish it were not like that, but this is literally the world we find ourselves in right now. And we can live in fear. We can live as if there is no resurrection after this. I'm not talking about actual death. I'm talking about the spiritual, emotional death that we all feel, that we don't talk about it. We're mad. We're upset. We're sad. We're just so frustrated with the situation, and we cry out as Mary and Martha, Lord, if you were here, none of this would have happened. And so we start blaming people. We start blaming people and saying it's your fault. No, it's your fault. We do all of that because we want to have some amount of control, because we don't want to admit the way of life that we once lived is now dead. It just is. That's the harsh truth. But it's not the end. It absolutely is not the end, because mortal, can these bones live again? And the answer is yes. Can Lazarus live again? The answer is yes. Can we live again after all this crazy crap? And the answer is yes. Nothing is over when it comes to Jesus. God is giving us a chance to rebuild, to fix mistakes, to make sure that we will be fine. But we have to believe in the resurrection, and more than just when it comes to death. We have to believe of a global resurrection, a resurrection of how things once were. There's always more to the story when it comes to Jesus. So live like it. Amen.